June 19th, 1944. Cambrai Airfield, northern France. Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche guided the captured P-51 B Mustang onto the grass strip, its Packard-Merlin engine settling into an idle that sounded wrong, too rough, too hesitant. The yellow paint on the aircraft's nose, tail, and belly gleamed in the afternoon sun, the Luftwaffe's way of ensuring their anti-aircraft gunners wouldn't shoot down their own prize. Lerche climbed from the cockpit, removed his leather helmet, and stared at the instrument panel one more time. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The numbers didn't make sense. This was supposed to be the fighter that was decimating the Luftwaffe. The Americans' long-range escort that could follow bombers all the way to Berlin and back, then turn around and hunt German fighters like wolves after sheep. Intelligence reports from the eastern and western fronts painted the P-51 as nearly invincible, faster than the Focke-Wulf 190 at altitude, more agile than the BFA 109, with range that seemed impossible for a single-engine fighter. But the aircraft Lerche had just flown felt sluggish, underpowered. At 20,000 feet, where this Mustang should have been in its element, it struggled to reach 400 miles per hour. The climb rate was mediocre. The acceleration felt flat. If this was what American pilots were flying, Lerche thought, then Luftwaffe intelligence had been catastrophically wrong about everything. What Lerche didn't know, what none of the test pilots at Zirkus Rosarius knew in that summer of 1944, was that they were testing a fighter with one hand tied behind its back. The captured P-51 ran on German C3 aviation fuel, a synthetic gasoline that the Reich's chemists had formulated through years of research. It was good fuel by German standards. It had gotten them through the Battle of Britain, carried them across North Africa, powered the invasion of Russia, but it wasn't American fuel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The P-51 Mustang didn't begin as an American design for the American military. It started, ironically, with a British requirement and an American company's desperation to stay solvent. In April of 1940, as Hitler's Wehrmacht crushed France and the Low Countries, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American aviation with an urgent request: build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. Britain needed fighters. It needed them immediately. And it would pay for them. Edgar Schmude, North American's chief designer, made a counter-proposal that would have seemed audacious in any other circumstances. Instead of building someone else's already obsolete fighter, he told the British, "Give us 120 days, and we'll design you something better." The British, perhaps out of desperation or recognition that the P-40 was already being outclassed over Europe, agreed. Schmude's team worked with extraordinary focus. The NA-73X prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, powered by an Allison V1710 engine. The British placed orders immediately, designating it the Mustang Mark I. But there was a problem that would haunt the early Mustangs. The Allison engine lost power dramatically above 15,000 feet. Its single-stage supercharger simply couldn't compress enough air at altitude to maintain performance. The Mustang Mark I was brilliant, below 12,000 feet fast, maneuverable, with exceptional range, but it was mediocre where it mattered most. In the high-altitude arena, where modern air combat was increasingly fought, the solution came from an unexpected quarter. In April of 1942, Ronald Harker, a test pilot for Rolls-Royce, flew a Mustang Mark I at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Boscombe, Down. He immediately recognized that the airframe was superb. The problem was purely the power plant. Harker suggested mating the Mustang's aerodynamically clean airframe with Rolls-Royce's Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the Spitfire. The Merlin's two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained power to 30,000 feet and beyond. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. With the Packard-built Merlin V1650 engine, the P-51 B and P-51 C variants became different airplanes entirely. Maximum speed jumped from 390 to 440 miles per hour at altitude. Service ceiling increased from 31,000 to 42,000 feet. Most importantly, the Merlin-powered Mustang maintained combat effectiveness at the altitudes where American bomber formations operated 25 to 30,000 feet. By June of 1944, when Lieutenant Thomas Fraser's P-51 B landed at Cambrai after being hit by anti-aircraft fire, the Mustang had been in combat over Europe for 6 months. American pilots knew what it could do. German pilots, facing increasing numbers of long-range American escorts, penetrating deeper into the Reich, knew what it could do. The question was whether German engineers and test pilots could figure out why. The Luftwaffe maintained a sophisticated captured aircraft evaluation program. As early as 1940, Oberleutnant Theodor Roell's reconnaissance units had been tasked with long-range intelligence gathering, flying everything from modified civil airliners to captured aircraft on clandestine missions. By 1943, this had evolved into specialized test units. The most prominent was Zirkus Rosarius, Rosarius's circus, named after its commander, Flugkapitän Theodor Rosarius. The unit was officially designated the second Staffel of the Versuchsverband Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, the experimental unit of the Luftwaffe High Command. Its mission was straightforward: capture, repair, test, and evaluate Allied aircraft, then travel to operational Luftwaffe bases to demonstrate these aircraft to frontline pilots, teaching them the strengths and weaknesses of what they'd face in combat. Zirkus Rosarius operated from Göttingen and later from facilities at Rechlin, the central German military aviation test facility. The unit used the Geschwaderkennung wing code T9, with individual aircraft receiving letters T9 plus CK, T9 plus HK, T9 plus PK, to prevent friendly fire from German anti-aircraft gunners unfamiliar with Allied silhouettes. All Zirkus Rosarius aircraft received distinctive bright yellow paint on their bellies, noses, and tails. German pilots joked darkly that it made the captured aircraft look like mechanical canaries. By June of 1944, Zirkus Rosarius had accumulated an impressive collection. Spitfires of various marks, including PR Mark 11 reconnaissance, variants, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, even a solitary captured Mosquito and a Typhoon. The arrival of Fraser's P-51 B, designated T9 plus CK after restoration, gave German engineers their first opportunity to comprehensively evaluate the aircraft that was increasingly dominating the skies over the Reich. The testing would be systematic and thorough. German test pilots would fly the Mustang at various altitudes, speeds, and configurations. They would engage in mock combat against Bf-109s and Favu-190s. They would measure climb rates, dive speeds, turning performance, and stall characteristics. They would evaluate the gun sight, the control harmony, the cockpit ergonomics, and slowly, methodically, they would reach a conclusion that intelligence officers would find deeply disturbing. The P-51 B they were testing wasn't performing anywhere near what they'd expected. The Packard V1657 Merlin engine that powered Lieutenant Fraser's captured Mustang was a marvel of precision engineering. Each engine required over 5,000 man-hours to produce. The two-stage supercharger used two separate centrifugal compressors in series, with an intercooler between stages to reduce the temperature of compressed air before it entered the engine. This allowed the Merlin to maintain sea-level manifold pressure, the boost pressure, feeding the cylinders up to approximately 19,000 feet, then gradually lose power in a controlled manner up to 30,000 feet and beyond. The engine's compression ratio was 6.0 to 1, modest by modern standards, deliberately conservative to allow operation on high-octane fuel at maximum boost without detonation. The fuel injector system precisely metered gasoline into the intake manifold. The reduction gearbox allowed the propeller to turn at optimal speed while the engine spun faster. Everything about the Merlin reflected decades of British engineering experience with supercharged aircraft engines. But all of this engineering sophistication meant nothing without the right fuel. Octane rating measures a fuel's resistance to premature ignition, what pilots and engineers called knock or detonation. When fuel explodes before the piston reaches the top of its compression stroke, the result is a violent pressure spike that can destroy pistons, crack cylinder heads, and burn valves. High-octane fuel allows higher compression ratios and higher boost pressures without detonation, which translates directly to more power. The rating system itself was developed in 1927 by American fuel chemist Graham Edgar. He created a scale based on two reference fuels, isooctane, which was highly resistant to knock, and N-heptane, which ignited easily. Pure isooctane was defined as 100 octane. Pure N-heptane was 0. A fuel rated at 87 octane performed equivalently to a mixture of 87% isooctane and 13% N-heptane under standardized test conditions. But there was a complexity that would cause confusion throughout the war. There were 2 octane measurements for each fuel, one for lean mixture operation and one for rich mixture. Rich mixture operation, with excess fuel flowing through the engine, allowed higher power output but increased fuel consumption. The extra fuel also cooled the cylinders, preventing detonation. For aviation fuels with ratings above 100, the rich mixture rating was expressed as a performance number rather than an octane rating, since you couldn't have more than 100% isooctane. American aviation fuel in 1944 was rated 100/130. The first number 100 represented lean mixture operation. The second number 130 was the performance number for rich mixture. This meant the fuel performed 30% better than pure isooctane under rich mixture conditions with high boost pressure. German C3 fuel, which the captured Mustangs ran on at Göttingen, was rated 100 octane by German standards. This referred to its lean mixture rating. German fuel specifications didn't emphasize the rich mixture rating the way American specifications did. When American technical intelligence teams examined German fuel after the war, they found its rich mixture performance was also around 130. On paper, late-war German C3 and American 100/130 were similar, but the chemical compositions were different, and those differences mattered. American 100/130 fuel was produced primarily from high-grade petroleum crude through a process called catalytic cracking, developed by French émigré Eugène Houdry and commercialized by Sun Oil and other American refiners. The process broke long-chain hydrocarbons into shorter ones, yielding gasoline with excellent anti-knock properties. American refiners then added tetraethyl lead, a compound that dramatically improved octane rating even in small quantities to boost performance further. German C3 fuel was largely synthetic, produced through the Fischer-Tropsch process that converted coal into liquid hydrocarbons. Germany had abundant coal but limited access to petroleum after losing Romanian oil fields and facing Allied strategic bombing of refineries. The Fischer-Tropsch process worked, producing usable aviation gasoline, but the resulting fuel had different combustion characteristics than petroleum-based gasoline. It burned differently. It vaporized differently. Its energy content per gallon was slightly lower. And while German chemists had managed to bring its octane rating up to acceptable levels, it simply wasn't optimized for engines designed around American or British petroleum-based fuels. When Hans-Werner Lerche advanced the throttle of Norst, T9 plus CK to takeoff power, the Merlin engine in the captured Mustang was trying to burn a fuel it had never been designed for. The boost pressure was lower than specification. The power output suffered, and every performance metric downstream from engine power, climb rate, maximum speed, acceleration suffered proportionally. The German test pilots didn't immediately understand this. They knew the fuel was different, of course, but fuel was fuel, wasn't it? If it had the same octane rating, it should produce the same power. That was the logical assumption. And because captured aircraft evaluations never included engine dynamometer testing that would require disassembling the engines, which would prevent flight testing, they had no way to measure actual power output. They could only infer it from aircraft performance. So the reports that filtered up through Luftwaffe intelligence described a P-51B that was good but not exceptional. Fast enough to be dangerous? Certainly. But not the superlative performer that frontline pilots reported facing over Berlin and Regensburg and Ploesti. The disparity created confusion at higher levels of the Luftwaffe command structure. Pilots in the field were insisting that the Mustang was nearly unbeatable at altitude. Test pilots at Göttingen were reporting that it was merely competitive. Someone, somewhere, had to be wrong. The truth, of course, was that everyone was right. The Mustang that frontline Luftwaffe pilots faced, filled with American 100/130 fuel, was an exceptional performer. The Mustang that Zirkus Rosarius tested, filled with German C3 fuel, was a pale shadow of that performance. But without understanding the fuel difference, German intelligence struggled to reconcile the contradictory data. This confusion would have operational consequences that extended well beyond simple performance assessments. It affected tactical decisions. It influenced strategic planning. And for pilots engaging Mustangs in combat, it meant fighting an enemy aircraft that performed significantly better than they'd been taught to expect. The fuel disparity also cut the other way, though German pilots rarely experienced it directly. When Americans or British captured German aircraft, they typically tested them on Allied fuel. Captured Bf-109s and few 190s, tested at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough or at Wright Field in Ohio, ran on British or American aviation gasoline, not German C3. In some cases, this may have given Allied test pilots an artificially optimistic view of German fighter performance. But because the Allies generally had superior fuel throughout the war, especially from 1940 onward, the margin of error worked in their favor. The story of how America developed superior aviation fuel begins not with military planning but with civilian air racing in the 1930s. James Harold, Doolittle Jimmy to everyone who knew him, had earned one of the first doctorates in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He was also one of America's most celebrated racing pilots, having won the Bendix Trophy and the Thompson Trophy, setting speed records that made headlines across the country. In 1930, while still on active duty with the Army Air Corps, Doolittle understood something that most military planners missed. The next war would be won not just by better aircraft designs, but by better fuel. When Doolittle left active duty in 1935 to work for Shell Oil as aviation fuels manager, he had a singular mission: convince the American military to adopt 100-octane fuel as standard. The problem was simple economics. In the mid-1930s, aviation gasoline was typically 70 to 80 octane. Automotive gasoline was around 40 octane. The market for aviation fuel was tiny, less than half of 1% of total gasoline consumption. Of that small amount, about 2/3 went to military aircraft and 1/3 to commercial aviation. Producing 100-octane fuel using existing refining methods cost $25 per gallon at a time when automotive fuel sold for less than 20 cents per gallon. No oil company would invest in the expensive refining infrastructure needed to produce high-octane fuel without guaranteed demand. No military would commit to expensive fuel without proven benefits. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It was a classic chicken and egg problem, and Doolittle spent years trying to break the deadlock. Within Shell, the project was mocked as Doolittle's million-dollar blunder. But Doolittle kept lobbying Congress and the Army, demonstrating the performance benefits at every opportunity. In 1937, the situation changed. Eugene Houdry, a French mechanical engineer who had emigrated to America, had been working on a catalytic cracking process that could efficiently convert petroleum into high-octane gasoline. Houdry's process used special catalysts to break down complex hydrocarbon molecules into simpler ones with better anti-knock properties. Working with Sun Oil Company at their refinery in Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, just west of Philadelphia, Houdry perfected the process. By 1938, Sun Oil could produce 100-octane fuel at about $2 per gallon, still expensive, but no longer prohibitive. That same year, after years of lobbying by Doolittle and others, the U.S. Army Air Corps and Navy finally agreed to standardize on 100-octane fuel for all new combat aircraft. Suddenly, there was a market. Shell, Sun Oil, Standard Oil, and other major refiners began building catalytic cracking units. Production ramped up quickly. When Britain entered the war in September of 1939, the Royal Air Force immediately began importing American 100-octane fuel. The first tanker load left the Standard Oil refinery in Aruba in June of 1939, bound for England. The impact on British fighter performance was immediate and dramatic. Spitfires and Hurricanes that had been using 87-octane fuel suddenly gained 25 to 34 miles per hour in maximum speed when switched to 100-octane. The higher octane allowed higher boost pressure from the supercharger without detonation, which meant more power at all altitudes. Engine reliability improved because engineers could run higher compression ratios without exceeding temperature limits. Maintenance intervals doubled from 500 to 1,000 hours between major overhauls. Luftwaffe pilots noticed the change immediately. In May and June of 1940, during the Battle of France, German fighters had been faster and generally superior to RAF Hurricanes and the early Spitfire marks. By August of 1940, when the Battle of Britain began in earnest, the same RAF fighters were suddenly competitive, superior at almost all altitudes. German intelligence was baffled. These were the same aircraft, same basic designs, same engines, same armament. What had changed? The answer, of course, was fuel. But because fuel chemistry is invisible to pilots, and because Luftwaffe technical intelligence didn't initially understand the significance of the octane difference, German pilots and commanders struggled to explain why their previous advantage had evaporated. Some attributed it to pilot training, others blamed tactics. A few suggested that British aircraft factories had made secret improvements to engine performance. The real answer that American fuel chemistry had given Britain a decisive edge took months to fully understand. Germany faced fundamental disadvantages in fuel production that no amount of technical skill could overcome. The Reich controlled no significant petroleum reserves. Romanian oil fields at Ploiești provided some supply, but never enough for Germany's military and industrial needs. Imports from the Soviet Union supplemented this before June of 1941, but Operation Barbarossa ended that arrangement. By 1942, Germany's aviation fuel came primarily from synthetic production coal converted to liquid hydrocarbons through the Fischer-Tropsch process. The Fischer-Tropsch process worked. German chemists, building on research that dated back to the 1920s, had developed it into a viable industrial method. At its peak, German synthetic fuel production supplied more than 50% of the Reich's total petroleum needs, but the process was expensive, slow, and vulnerable to strategic bombing. Each synthetic fuel plant required enormous capital investment, skilled workers, and secure coal supplies. And the fuel it produced, while adequate, simply wasn't as good as petroleum-based gasoline refined with modern catalytic cracking methods. German C3 fuel had a lean mixture octane of approximately 100 and a rich mixture performance number around 130 on paper, equivalent to American 100/130, but the similarities ended there. The synthetic fuel's combustion characteristics differed from petroleum-based fuel in ways that affected engine performance. It vaporized less readily at cold temperatures, making engine starts more difficult. Its energy content per gallon was about 3% lower, and it contained trace compounds from the coal to liquid conversion process that could form deposits in fuel systems over time. Most critically, for captured aircraft testing, German C3 fuel wasn't formulated for engines designed around petroleum-based American fuel. The Packard-Merlin engine in a P-51 had been developed, tested, and calibrated using American 100/130 fuel. Its fuel metering system, ignition timing, and boost pressure limits all assumed fuel with specific combustion properties. When that engine ran on chemically different German synthetic fuel, performance suffered in ways that were difficult to quantify without sophisticated instrumentation. The test pilots at Zirkus Rosarius were skilled aviators with years of combat experience. Hans-Werner Lerche, who conducted many of the evaluations, was one of Germany's premier test pilots. But they were assessing aircraft performance, not conducting chemical analysis of fuel combustion. They measured speeds, climb rates, and turning performance. They described handling qualities and combat characteristics. What they couldn't measure was how much power the Merlin engine was actually producing compared to its design specifications. In July of 1944, Lerche filed his official report on the P-51 B designated T9 plus CK. The report was thorough and professional. Maximum speed at 25,000 feet, approximately 410 miles per hour. Service ceiling, approximately 39,000 feet. Rate of climb at sea level, approximately 2,800 feet per minute. Turn radius at combat speed, comparable to Bf-109G at high altitude, inferior to W-190A at low altitude. The conclusion: the P-51B was a formidable opponent with excellent range and good high-altitude performance, but not overwhelmingly superior to Germany's best fighters. In the hands of a skilled pilot, a Bf-109G or Fevu-190A could engage the Mustang on roughly equal terms, especially if the German pilot could dictate the altitude and circumstances of engagement. This assessment would prove tragically optimistic. Frontline German pilots continued reporting that Mustangs were faster, climbed better, and maintained combat effectiveness at altitudes where German fighters struggled. The disparity between test results and combat reports continued to puzzle Luftwaffe intelligence analysts. Some suggested that American pilots received better training or more aggressive tactical guidance. Others proposed that the Mustangs operating over Germany were somehow different from the captured example, perhaps a special high-performance variant reserved for escort duty. The real explanation was simpler and more frustrating. The captured Mustang at Göttingen was running on the wrong fuel, and nobody realized it mattered as much as it did. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By September of 1944, Zirkus Rosarius had received 2 more P-51 Mustangs, a P-51C designated T9 plus HK and a P-51D designated T9 plus PK. The P-51D was particularly interesting because it represented the latest production variant, with the distinctive bubble canopy that provided exceptional visibility. Test pilots flew all 3 Mustangs extensively, comparing them against each other, and against captured examples of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The evaluations noted that the P-51D was slightly faster than the earlier B and C models, probably due to aerodynamic refinements and reduced drag from the bubble canopy. But even the D model's performance at Göttingen didn't match what intelligence reports suggested it should achieve. The disconnect remained unexplained. Meanwhile, over the skies of Germany, the real story was unfolding daily. American bomber formations, sometimes exceeding 1,000 aircraft, penetrated deep into the Reich, escorted by hundreds of P-51 Mustangs. The escorts didn't just defend the bombers, they actively hunted German fighters. By late 1944, Luftwaffe pilots faced a terrible dilemma: attack the bombers and risk engagement with the escorts, or avoid the escorts and let the bombers through unopposed. Experienced German pilots developed tactics to mitigate the Mustang's advantages. They tried to engage bombers at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where even the Merlin-powered Mustang's performance began to fall off. They used high-speed diving attacks to minimize exposure time. They concentrated on straggling bombers separated from the main formations. But none of these tactics could change the fundamental mathematics. American fighters could escort bombers to any target in Germany, stay with them throughout the mission, fight their way home, and still have fuel reserves. The Germans had nothing comparable. The Messerschmitt Bf 1-10, designed as a long-range escort fighter, had proven vulnerable to single-engine fighters and was largely withdrawn from the role. The Focke-Wulf TAR 152, intended as a high-altitude interceptor, entered production too late and in too few numbers to matter. German pilots flew superlative aircraft. The Bf 109 and Fu 190 were among the finest fighters of the war, but they flew them under impossible circumstances, outnumbered, outranged, and increasingly running on inadequate fuel supplies. By December of 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated further. Allied bombing of German synthetic fuel plants had reduced aviation fuel production to a fraction of requirements. Pilot training programs, already abbreviated by fuel shortages, were cut again. New pilots reached frontline units with perhaps 1/3 the flight hours that their predecessors had received in 1941 and 42. They faced American pilots with extensive training, superior aircraft, and unlimited fuel. The final irony of the captured Mustang story emerged in March of 1945. As Allied forces advanced into Germany from both east and west, Göttingen came under artillery fire. Zirkus Rosarius evacuated its most important aircraft, including the captured Mustangs, to Lechfeld in Bavaria. In May of 1945, American troops overran Lechfeld and recovered the P-51D that had been designated T9 plus PK. The aircraft, repainted in German markings with its distinctive yellow nose and belly, returned to American hands. Army Air Force's technical intelligence officers examined the captured Mustang with interest. They noted the German modifications, changes to the radio installation, addition of German instrumentation, modifications to the gun sight. They photographed it extensively for intelligence records. And then, almost as an afterthought, someone suggested actually flying it to see how it performed on American fuel. The difference was dramatic and immediate. With proper 100/130 octane fuel, the Mustang's Packard-Merlin came alive. Maximum speed at 25,000 feet jumped to 443 miles per hour, more than 30 miles per hour, faster than what German test pilots had recorded. Climb rate increased to 3,200 feet per minute at sea level. The engine ran, smoother, cooler, and more responsively. It was, quite literally, a different airplane. The American intelligence officers prepared a brief report, noting the discrepancy. The report concluded that German evaluations of captured American aircraft were probably significantly understating actual performance because of fuel differences. The report was filed and largely forgotten by May of 1945. The European war was over, and attention had shifted to Japan and the Pacific. But for historians examining the air war over Europe, the captured Mustang story reveals something profound about technological advantages in modern warfare. Germany had superb aircraft designers, skilled engineers, and experienced test pilots. The Luftwaffe's captured aircraft evaluation program was sophisticated and thorough. German intelligence officers were not incompetent, yet they consistently underestimated American fighter performance because they didn't fully understand or couldn't replicate the fuel that made that performance possible. The advantage wasn't just in octane ratings or chemical formulas, it was in industrial capacity. America could produce millions of gallons of high-quality aviation fuel using petroleum reserves and refining infrastructure that Germany simply didn't possess. Eugene Houdry's catalytic cracking process, developed in corporate laboratories in Pennsylvania, gave the Allies a decisive advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance or strategic planning could overcome. German synthetic fuel production was a remarkable technical achievement. Converting coal into gasoline at industrial scale required sophisticated chemistry and engineering. But it was always a stopgap measure, a response to Germany's fundamental lack of petroleum resources. The synthetic fuel kept German aircraft flying, but it couldn't match the performance that American petroleum-based fuel delivered. And in air combat, where margins are measured in miles per hour and feet per minute, that difference meant everything. The story also reveals how technical intelligence can mislead when evaluators don't understand the full context of what they're measuring. The German test pilots at Göttingen weren't wrong in their assessments. The P-51 B running on German fuel really did perform exactly as they reported. The error was in assuming that this represented how the aircraft performed in American service. Without understanding the fuel difference, Luftwaffe intelligence consistently underestimated the threat that Mustangs posed. This had real operational consequences. German fighter tactics in late 1944 and early 1945 were based partly on intelligence assessments that understated Mustang performance. Pilots were taught to engage under circumstances that might have been reasonable against the fuel-compromised Mustangs at Göttingen, but were suicidal against properly fueled Mustangs over Berlin. The intelligence failure, rooted in something as prosaic as fuel chemistry, contributed to the air superiority that American fighters established over Germany in the final year of the war. The captured Mustang story illuminates a larger truth about the Second World War. Victory often came not from individual technical brilliance, but from industrial systems working in harmony. Germany produced excellent aircraft throughout the war. The Bf 109 remained competitive until the end. The Fu-190 was widely regarded as one of the finest fighters ever built. The jet-powered Me-262, though arriving too late to affect the outcome, was years ahead of anything the Allies fielded. But aircraft performance depends on more than airframe design. It depends on engines running at optimal power. Engines depend on fuel that matches their design parameters. Fuel production depends on petroleum resources, or, failing that, expensive synthetic alternatives. Petroleum access depends on geography and strategic control. In this chain of dependencies, Germany's lack of domestic petroleum reserves became a vulnerability that cascaded through every aspect of air combat capability. American industrial advantages extended beyond fuel production. By 1944, the United States was producing more than 96,000 aircraft annually, more than Germany, Britain, Japan, and the Soviet Union combined. American factories built over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war. When one was lost in combat or to mechanical failure, another arrived to replace it within days. German factories, by contrast, produced roughly 40,000 Bf-109s throughout the entire war, impressive for a single aircraft type, but inadequate against enemies who could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The fuel disparity also affected pilot training. American aviation cadets in 1944 received between 200 and 300 flight hours before reaching operational squadrons. They practiced gunnery, formation flying, and combat tactics until proficiency became automatic. German pilot training, constrained by fuel shortages from 1943 onward, provided perhaps 100 hours of flight time, barely enough for basic competency. New German pilots reached frontline squadrons with minimal experience, facing veteran American pilots who had been flying for years. In the final accounting, the story of German test pilots flying captured Mustangs reveals how technological warfare functions as a system rather than a collection of individual components. A brilliant aircraft design matters little if the fuel to power it is inadequate. Superior pilot training means nothing without fuel for practice. Tactical innovation cannot overcome systematic industrial disadvantages. Germany's test pilots at Göttingen provided accurate assessments of what they could measure, but they were measuring compromised version of American capability, filtered through German fuel chemistry and industrial limitations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The captured P-51s with their yellow bellies and German markings, preserved in photographs from 1944 and 45, stand as monuments to this fundamental truth. In modern warfare, technical performance emerges from the entire industrial ecosystem that supports it. The Mustang's dominance came not just from Edgar Schmude's aerodynamic design or Rolls-Royce's superb Merlin engine, but from Eugene Howdry's catalytic cracking process, from American petroleum reserves, from the industrial capacity to produce millions of gallons of high-octane fuel and deliver it to airfields across England. When Hans-Werner Lerche climbed down from T9 plus CK that afternoon in June of 1944, puzzled by the gap between what he'd just flown and what intelligence reports described, he was experiencing firsthand the consequences of Germany's industrial disadvantages. The Mustang was everything American pilots claimed, but only when running on American fuel. That distinction, invisible to everyone at Göttingen, made all the difference between a competitive fighter and a war-winning weapon. The Luftwaffe's confusion about Mustang performance, rooted in this fuel disparity, persisted until the war's end. Frontline pilots continued reporting capabilities that test pilots couldn't replicate. Intelligence officers struggled to reconcile contradictory data, and German fighters continued engaging American escorts under tactical assumptions based on incomplete understanding. The captured aircraft program, despite its sophistication and thoroughness, had fallen victim to a variable that nobody thought to control: the fuel feeding the engines they were evaluating. In the broader narrative of the Crossdedam, air war over Europe, the fuel story represents one of many cumulative advantages that gave the Allies air superiority by late 1944. No single factor was decisive. But fuel quality, combined with numerical superiority, better pilot training, radar-guided intercepts, and systematic destruction of German aviation infrastructure, created conditions where Luftwaffe resistance became increasingly futile. By March of 1945, German fighters mounted token opposition to American bomber streams that operated almost with impunity. The captured Mustangs at Göttingen, flying on borrowed fuel that compromised their performance, symbolized Germany's larger predicament, fighting a modern technological war without the industrial foundation to sustain it. The test pilots did their jobs competently. The intelligence officers analyzed data professionally. The tactical planners developed reasonable strategies based on available information. But none of it mattered because the fundamental premise was wrong. They were evaluating a shadow of American capability, dimmed by fuel chemistry they couldn't replicate and industrial capacity they couldn't match. That gap, measured in octane numbers and gallons per day, ultimately proved as decisive as any battle fought in the skies over Europe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.